From deep within the mountains of Anatolia, a proud and warlike people would unite, after centuries of infighting and localized warfare, to form a state that would last 500 years. They would defeat the pharaohs of Egypt in battle and lay waste to empires. They were the Hittites. In the steppe land along the Khazil or Mak River, the Hattian people lived for many centuries, trading vast amounts of timber and wool, predominantly to Assyrian merchants. Around the early 2nd millennium BC, a new people began to dominate the region, the Neshites, calling themselves after their capital city of Nesha. The Neshites fought against each other as often as the majority Hattian population, until one man united all the warring states together. He took the name Hattushali, meaning man from Hattusha, an old Hattian city he established as his capital to the north. The land was called Hatti, after the original inhabitants, and his people would eventually be known as the Hittites. Hattushali spent his life campaigning, extracting tribute from weaker states. His string of victories would come to an end in the south, failing to take the city of Aleppo, then known as Halab, which was capital city of the wealthy kingdom of Yamhad, which controlled the major trade routes between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Hattushali, like his successors, was high priest of his people. Upon his birth, the Hittites believed the king was adopted by the gods, and when he died, he became a god. Hattusili was succeeded by his grandson, Mursili, who was still a child and controlled by his advisors early in life. Hatti was of minor concern to the great powers of the day, until Mursili renewed his grandfather's campaigns. Upon reaching adulthood, and conquered the kingdom of Yamhad, then the Hittites would shock the Bronze Age world. Mursili marched his army along the Euphrates, 1,000 miles from the Hittite heartland, and sacked the city of Babylon, which had been the premier cosmopolitan center of culture, learning, and trade in the Near East for the previous 200 years. The Amorite dynasty of Hammurabi was brought to a sudden and unexpected end. Upon returning home, laden with plunder and slaves, Mursili did not receive the hero's welcome he perhaps expected, and was instead murdered by rivals who had grown powerful in his long absence. For approximately 65 years, murdering one's predecessor became the norm. A cycle of murder and retaliation between factions of the Hittite nobility, vying for the imperial throne, eroded the empire as rapidly as it had risen. When Telepinu took the throne of Hattusha, Hatti had been relegated to a third-rate power, and the king as a petty warlord, barely in control of Hattusha. When Telepinu's wife and son were murdered by rivals for his throne, it appeared to be just another chapter in the final stages of a dying empire. Telepinu, weary of the seemingly endless suicidal cycle of bloodshed, made a proclamation, sparing the murderers from execution, opting to banish them from the kingdom instead. He also declared an official method for determining a successor. The warring factions ceased their self-destruction and rallied to support Telepinu. His single act of mercy united the land of Hatti. Telepinu's reign marked the end of what historians call the Hittite Old Kingdom. For the next 70 years, the period known as the Hittite Middle Kingdom was marked with constant war with the Kaska people settled along the Black Sea coast. The Hittites twice moved the capital south temporarily during this period, to avoid the attacks of the fierce mountain tribes that even managed to sack Hattusa once. A significant development during this period is the beginning of the wide and effective use of treaties and alliances with neighboring states. Approximately half of all the treaties uncovered in the Near East involved the Hittites. The gains made by the early treaties were wiped out by the reign of Shupilulima, also pronounced Suppiluliuma, who obtained the throne by murdering his brother, breaking the edict of Telepinu. The allies gained over the previous century abandoned Hatti. A coalition of Kaskas, Arzawa city-states to the west, and the Mitanni Empire waged war on the Hittites. Suppiluliuma first subdued the Kashkas, using his considerable diplomatic skill to convince many to join his army. He then did the same with the Arzawa to the west, rallying the tough and warlike people of Anatolia to his cause, with the threat of force and the promise of eastern riches. This vast army then conquered the mineral-rich kingdom of Kizuwanta and his strategic ports, which had been a long-time Hittite ally before becoming a Mitanni vassal state. The Mitanni Empire had filled much of the power vacuum left by the Hittites after their destruction of Yamhad and Amorite Babylon. They are the earliest confirmed people to use the spoked-wheeled chariot and may have invented it. The Hittites later became masters of the heavy chariot and employed a Mitanni expert at their court. The Mitanni were a Hurrian-speaking people, a language unrelated.
I'm in the video. This is part one of Part of Hittites. First, I want to give his honor. I'll praise the spirit of Yahweh because he's more one that woke us up to his truth. With that, Shalom, Bo.